Hello, AP Gov. It is time for our first home lesson. So technically, this is lesson 1.2. Don't blame me, I didn't vote. So what we're going to talk about today is everything dealing with voting. In lesson 1.1, we did sort of a general view of power, and we took a look at different types of governments and how they're set up and where they put power. Then we took a look at the three uh, theories of American democracy. One of them is the participatory democracy, where people actively make decisions. And so this is going to kind of go along with that. So you're going to want to just take notes in a notebook or follow along on a Google Doc or Word Doc and just sort of take notes as we go along. This is pretty straightforward stuff. So some vocabulary that you're going to need to know and make note cards on. Ticket splitting is when somebody votes for both Republican and Democratic candidates in the same election. So, for instance, they might choose a Republican governor and a Democratic attorney general. So ticket splitting is when you go back and forth between the parties. Straight ticket voting, as you might expect, then is just when you go down and you pick all of the Republicans, all of the Democrats, all of the whatever. Political efficacy means, do you think your vote matters and counts or not? If you have political efficacy, you believe that your vote matters. If you lack political efficacy, then you don't believe that it matters and you don't believe that your vote really counts. For this, I want you to jot down two groups that lack political efficacy. They tend to be minorities and they tend to be the poor. Those are two groups that lack political efficacy. There are two types of elections, federal elections in the United States, presidential ones, which we are going to have in November. That is an election that has the presidential election part of it. And then in 2 years, we will have what are called midterms. And these tend to be congressional elections with the House and Senate, but no presidential election. Midterms usually are pretty predictable. The president's party always does worse, and that is usually because people by this time are kind of upset at the president, and so they take it out on him or her by voting for members of the opposite party. And so usually the president's party does worse. But we do know that presidential elections have a much better turnout than midterms. Midterms are probably around 40 to 50%, and presidential elections are somewhere between 50 to 60%. So those are some key elements of vocabulary that you're going to have to keep track of. So distrust of government is something that usually has to do a little bit with political efficacy. If there is a great distrust of government, then usually people have a lack of political efficacy. Obviously, the Vietnam War had a big deal because people felt like the government was lying to them. Watergate was a big deal because they felt like the president was lying. And so what you'll notice from this graph is that over time, from 1958 to 2010, people who always distrust government is relatively stable. It's usually, for the most part, below 10%. It does start a little bit above 10%, but for the most part, it was below 10%. That's how you would read this trend. Some of the time or never, do you distrust the government? Sometime or never trust the government. You notice that that has gone up over time, and that do you trust the government? Most of the time, you can see that that has gone down over time. So from 55 to now below 20%, whereas you trust the government sometime or never. That was at 20, and now it's all the way up to 80. So When we're prepping for our quantitative analysis FRQ, so this is an FRQ where you have to read a graph like this and then make some determinations. One of the questions that you will always see is identify a trend. And so there are 3 trends that you could identify and get the point for. You could use the always trend and basically say that it is usually below 15%. Or you could say that people trusting the government most of the time has gone down from 55% to 20%. Or you could say that people who never or sometimes trust the government has gone up from 20 to 80%. Those would be the 3 that would get you the point for identifying. Then you would have to probably answer the question, make or draw a conclusion from that. So basically you have to answer, why is that happening? Why is the sometime or never trust the government going up, or most of the time going down, or always staying the same? And so you really just have to explain why that trend is happening when they ask you to draw a conclusion. Another one that you'll see here is that midterm elections tend to be under 50% turnout, where presidential elections are somewhere between 50 to 60% turnout. And that would be another trend. And so you would state from 1948 to 2012, presidential elections out eligible or have more voters than midterm elections. And then you would have to say midterm elections have between 30 to 40%, while presidential elections have 50 to 60%. And then if they asked you to draw a conclusion, you would then once again have to explain why. All right, so some more things that you're going to need to jot down for notes. In America, we have always tried to expand our ability to vote. Basically, over the years, we've gone from when the United States started, only white men with property could vote, and then we lifted that to just any white man. And then, starting with a series of amendments, we end up expanding it to other groups. So you're going to want to jot down these amendments. So the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. Initially, it did say only race, but remember that women didn't have the right to vote. So in essence, it just gave African American men the right to vote. Then 100 years ago today, or 100 years ago this year, women got the right to vote in 1920. And then with the 23rd Amendment, it expanded voting for the president to Washington, D.C. They had not been able to vote for president if you lived in Washington, D.C. prior to this amendment. And then finally in 1971, because of the Vietnam War, we decided to drop the voting age from 21 to 18. They figured if you can get drafted, then you should be able to vote. So make sure you have those 4 amendments and what they did, and what they all have in common is that they expanded the right to vote, or the right to vote is also known as suffrage. We also expand suffrage with another amendment, but this amendment actually didn't allow for something to happen. It actually banned something from happening, which is the 24th Amendment. The 24th Amendment shot down the ability for states to create poll taxes, basically forcing people to pay to vote. That was shot down with the 24th Amendment. And then the Voting Rights Amendment of 1965 prohibited other strategies to eliminate people from voting. You could not give people a literacy test. You could not have things like the grandfather clause, or any of the other, just the white primaries that sometimes happen. And it also invoked states to have to open up their election cycles and registering to vote to make things more fair. So the Voting Rights Act had a huge impact in expanding voting and banning practices that limited voting, especially for African Americans and minorities. So the 24th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act do that. So now in your notes, there are 4 kinds of voters, or there are 4 types of voters, or another way of saying it, there are 4 factors that influence how you will vote. The number 1 influence is called the group benefit voter, and this is 42% of people who vote. You basically vote on what group you feel like you belong to, and you're going to vote for the candidate that's going to best help your group. So for instance, I'm a teacher, so I'm going to vote for the candidate that's going to best help teachers. I'm also a male in West County, so I'm going to vote for the candidate who's going to help males in West County. And basically, however you break yourself down in whatever group you feel like you belong to, you are going to vote for the person that benefits your group. Hence the name, group benefit voter. Pretty straightforward. Number 2, nature of the times, which is about 25% of the time. Basically, this says that you vote for candidates that are already in office if things are good, and you vote for the other party when things are bad. If this is the case, this does not look good for Trump with the coronavirus and the economic problems based on that. That would say that the nature of the time voter would vote for somebody of the other party. And so if that holds true, that could be bad news for the incumbent party, which is right now Donald Trump. No issue content. There are some people who just vote based on something as simple as I recognize the name, I don't recognize the other name, so I'm going to vote for the recognized name, even though they may actually believe in nothing similar to that person. So basically, 22% of people give no reason why they voted for a particular candidate. And then finally, in the smallest number, these are your hardcore ideologues. So we are going to find out eventually in this class who is our king conservative or queen conservative, or who is our queen or king liberal. Those hardcore people, they're going to vote for people that are also hardcore conservative or liberals. As you can see, most people don't vote by ideology. They usually go for another thing, but there are some that are hardcore ideologues, and thus they vote that way. What has stopped people from voting in the past? Literacy tests, where you have to read something, and because African Americans were not allowed to be taught to read right after Civil War, this was a way to keep them out. And poor people sometimes have education issues, and so they also would have troubles with literacy tests. So, and in fact, I've heard of times where somebody was given a blank sheet of paper, and the white person was giving a blank sheet of paper to a black person. The person said, "Read this piece of paper," and the black person responded, "I can't. There's nothing on it." And the person said, "Oh, you can't? You fail the literacy test." So they literally were that obvious in how to do things. Poll taxes, we already said the 24th Amendment bans that. Grandfather clauses, white primaries. Grandfather clause says if your grandfather voted, then you can vote. Well, for people right around the Civil War, that was impossible because their grandfather was a slave. White primaries, they didn't hold anything back. They just said if you are white, then you can vote. Today, there are some people who believe that the voter ID laws are hindering. And we also have mail-in ballots, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, or mail-in voting, or mail voting. Let's talk a little bit about the voter ID laws. African Americans, 25% of them do not have a valid ID. Asians, 20. Latinos, 19. 18 to 24, 18. Seniors, 18. Poor, 15. Why wouldn't people have, say, a driver's license? Well, if you can't afford a car, then there's no reason for you to have a driver's license. If you can't afford a driver's license, for those of you who have gotten one, you know that they cost money. If you are poor, you can't afford one. Well, if you need a photo ID to vote and you are poor and you don't have a car, then that makes it very difficult for you to vote. And so when a state has a voter ID law, it tends to hurt these groups. And we're going to find out here in just a little bit that these groups have something in common, that they tend to vote Democratic. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Here are basically the current requirements with no voter ID law, so you don't have to have any ID. Those are your gray states. And you can see that they are primarily in the Northeast, the West Coast, and then a smattering in the upper Midwest. And then you have to have some form of ID. It doesn't have to necessarily be photo. It could be non-photo, like a bill that has your name and address on it. And you can see that Missouri is one of those states. So you do have to have an ID. It can be photo or non-photo, but it has to have your name and address on it if it is a non-photo. And so you can see that those are the Columbia blue ones. Ones that say you have to have a photo ID, but they have a very large amount of possibilities. It can be a driver's license, it can be just an ID, it could be a college ID, it could be some other thing. Those are the ones in yellow, and then the strict ones that say you've got to have a driver's license or you have to have a passport. Those would be the ones that are in these light greenish gray ones. And you can see that there are not too many of those, but those are the ones that have strict ones. But you notice that many of them are down here in the South, and again, that impacts a particular group of people. What effect has this had? You can see that it helped Republican. Again, we're only talking 1.2%, so we're not talking a huge amount, but for my hardcore Democrats, they're not going to like this very much. For my hardcore Republicans, they're going to be like, it's a pretty small number to begin with. So let's get into why people who can vote don't vote. Pre-registration. Believe it or not, some people don't realize that you have to pre-register to vote. And by the way, you can do so at any public library, including Parkway West, if we ever get back to school. And you can also do it when you register for your license. Difficulty in absentee voting. If you're not going to be where you live on voting day, then you have to go through a process to get an absentee voting, and it is a little bit cumbersome in order to go through. Believe it or not, some people don't like to vote during presidential ones in particular because they feel like there are just too many offices on the ballot. They don't know enough, and so they just say, I'm not going to do it. A big one is that in the United States, we do it on a Tuesday in November, whereas most countries today in the modern industrialized world do it on weekends. And so should the election day be a national holiday where we don't vote and therefore you can vote anytime? People who have to work, that makes it hard for them to vote. Because political parties are weaker, they don't really stir up the vote as much as they did in the past. College students don't vote because oftentimes they are away from where they live. So if you go to Columbia, you still have to come back to St. Louis to vote if your driver's license has your address as here in St. Louis. And then some people just lack political efficacy. They don't want to vote, or they don't think it makes a difference. Why can't people vote? These are people who are prohibited. You have to be an American citizen to vote. Even if you are a resident alien, you have to be an American citizen to vote. If you're an illegal alien, obviously you can't vote. Some people cannot vote because physically they cannot get to the polls, or they have some sort of mental handicap that prevents them from voting. Felons in some states are not allowed to vote, but we are seeing more and more states give that right back to those people. Once they have done their time, then they are allowed to vote. But that's the difference between why don't people vote and why can't people vote. Should states adopt mail-in voting? Especially with the COVID crisis going on right now, a lot of people are not going to feel very comfortable going into a public place to vote. We did do it in August, but again, in August, there's just not the turnout that there probably will be in November. What are the pros to mail-in voting? Every voter would have the option to do it or not. You don't have to vote mail-in if you want. They would just mail you the ballot, and then it's your choice to mail it back or not. It would obviously reduce lines in voting. It would reduce exposure to COVID or flu or anything else that might be popping up later on, and it would increase voter participation. We are in some states that do this. For instance, Utah, they have around 80% turnout rate, which is much higher than the United States. The cons, if you listen to Donald Trump and the Republicans, they would say that it gives a very big ability for fraud, even though voting fraud is relatively non-existent statistically as of right now, even in states that do have mail-in voting. But obviously the big one is cost, is that the federal government would have to pick that up, and that would increase it. And as of right now, and I'm talking to you, know that there's a controversy going on about Donald Trump sort of defunding or limiting how the post office does, or I shouldn't say Donald Trump is doing it, but his postmaster general has been putting up some pretty awkward rules and moving machinery around to sort of limit potentially the ability of the post office to deal with mail-in voting. But as of today, the Postmaster General has basically said that they're going to do away with those restrictive rules and go back to the way that things had been done. So we'll talk more about this potentially in class when we come back, but be ready to talk a little bit about this. This is going to be potentially the new wave of voting. Missouri has really not been, our current Secretary of State is not a real big fan of this. He is a Republican. So we'll see what happens if and when we do get a new Secretary of State or a new governor, and how this might change. We, as you can see, in order to do a mail-in or an absentee, you have to have an excuse in Missouri and in these states. If you live in a green state, you do not have to have an excuse. And then in the yellow states, these are the states that automatically do mail-in voting. And you can see that there's not very many: Hawaii, Colorado, Utah, and then Oregon and Washington. But they have had very good success with it. They do it for all elections, whereas if you're in the green, you can do it for no reason whatsoever. In Missouri, you have to have a reason. And then finally, voter registration. If we made it easier to register, would that increase turnout? Well, we actually know the answer to this, because of the Motor Voter Bill of 1993, which basically said when you go to receive or renew your driver's license, you can also register to vote. The impact of that law, and I believe this is a vocabulary as well, the impact of that law is that it did increase registration, including minority registration, but then when it came time to vote, the turnouts were exactly the same. So it actually meant that more people were staying home because they had registered to vote but then didn't come out. So does making registration easier increase turnout? The answer to that is no. It increases registration, but it has not so far increased turnout. So that's a little bit of our first one. That was just under 30 minutes. Hopefully it wasn't too bad. If you have any questions, see me at the morning office hours, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thanks for listening. See you later.